as we look at the excellence of researcher and of research teams, training, and the research process itself. But the first thing I want to do, let's see if I can move these slides, is to put myself back in 2008 when I was an HQP for an NCE on advanced foods and materials. Unfortunately, the NCE did not make it beyond one term of 7 years, but those were really fantastic years, and really appreciate the support that was given to HQPs as I was then. The funny thing is I just spent about 10 years in the US, and I was coming back to Canada to join this NCE and didn't quite know much about NCEs. And lo and behold, walk into a bookstore and I find this book that is specifically about NCEs dating back to 2006. And what was interesting for me to look back at this is that then, after the NCEs had been created in 1998 or so under Prime Minister Mulroney, the aspect of further industry connections between researchers and industry was still a little bit sort of questioned and controversial. And I think this particular NCE's real tribute to how necessary that engagement between academic research and industry is, and hope that many of you will sort of pursue those opportunities that you've just heard about in industry. So here we go with the topic of EDI. What is EDI in the research context? So thinking of equity, you'll often see this term come up more in the context of actual laws, policies, processes, and really tries to remove what we would refer to as systemic barriers, those that are sort of so embedded in the way that we do things that it takes a bit of a closer look and a different perspective to look at the way things are, to sort of notice that they can sometimes really be advantageous to certain types of researchers who do research in certain ways, and truly disadvantageous to others, other approaches or other researchers. And in fact, more and more we're identifying that some of those barriers really line up with individual characteristics. So what we hope to do in the context of research is particularly to look at the funding mechanisms we have, our funding opportunities, and making sure they're equitable so that everyone has sort of a fair chance of succeeding in getting that funding. And more we're talking about making sure there are equitable funding outcomes. So not just in terms of looking at who comes in, there aren't necessarily barriers at the front end, but also how successful people are once they have entered into the research ecosystem, once they've become applicants, and whether they fare well in the outcomes. Diversity is a notion that really speaks to just looking around and counting to see who are the folks around a particular research institution or just broadly in the research ecosystem. The three agencies have been collecting more data, and we're starting to really understand how each of our different research communities, natural sciences, engineering, interesting differences there, but across health research, how that community demographically looks like, and also looking at social sciences. So diversity measures quantitatively the sort of makeup of our ecosystem. There are several personal characteristics that you can focus on. For purposes of the EDI work that the three agencies are doing, we focus primarily on women, Indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, people from visible minorities or racialized groups, and also members of LGBTQ+ communities. And then inclusion is, in contrast, more of a qualitative sort of measure. We're trying to see that people have a sense of belonging. So you can look around and see lots of different people, but do they feel like they're part of it, or that they're still very much external to it? You know, an imposter syndrome in the context of career, as we just heard about, people who are from minority groups, people who are underrepresented in a community, in a group, in a lab, in an institution, often will have that sense of, I don't belong. So that is something that we try and consider and bring some change in. So here are some just random examples of what the literature, those who are starting to really look at the nitty-gritty of what is going on in the research ecosystem, what they're finding. subtle gender biases that favor male students over female students. Considering that it is much easier if you're abled person than a disabled person to make it into academia. How there's a sense that a career in science is a linear career. You start off as a student, you do well, you move on as master's, doctoral, postdoc, on and on and on in a very linear fashion, when in fact a whole lot of people have interruptions in their careers, oftentimes because of families. Oftentimes women will take those interruptions or longer interruptions. How can we move away from that expectation? And an excellent career in research necessarily means a linear trajectory. And then how sometimes various practices, unprofessional practices and peer reviews can be particularly detrimental to underrepresented groups in STEM. Oops, change this way. So what are some of the barriers? I'm sort of alluding to these already. Few role models to look up to know that you can have a place in various places if no one like you has been there before. People who experience unintentional biases, but sometimes some almost intentional biases. They're not trained the same way there. Well, does that mean that they can't do the work? There are then, even worse though, some environments that can be fairly hostile, where stereotypes are perpetuated, and in fact, where people will feel that little jokes here and there, those microaggressions, really take a toll. And that can become a real deterrent to pursue an academic career or to pursue science in some instances. And what we also are starting to recognize is that we've looked at measuring excellence in research in very narrow ways. I alluded to that already. So that those indicators of research excellence actually might be biasing what we do value and what we undervalue. And if we just re-examine those indicators of excellence, maybe we'd see a larger pool of different talents, different approaches to research coming from different types of individuals. That would actually benefit us all. So just a simple introduction to EDI in the context of research. Let me say a few words about what the tri-agencies are doing about it. But first, whenever we're in government, we talk about policy drivers. These ideas of EDI, even though we might be bringing them into the research ecosystem, are not new. 1982, Charter of Rights and Freedoms, individuals have the right to equal protection and equal benefit under the law. And the groups that I previously mentioned, I had mentioned 5, but for a long time we had focused on 4 equity designated groups. And those 4 groups had come from a federal piece of legislation on employment equity. So we are sometimes in the space still very much influenced by this thinking that dates back a couple of decades, uses some terminology that's a little bit outdated. The Employment Equity Act spoke of Aboriginal peoples. Now in Canada, we refer to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit as Indigenous peoples. And less are the visible minorities at all. More so we use the term of racialized groups. So these are important pieces of legislation to keep in mind as to where these concepts come from and what is it that we're inspired by in the work that we do across the agencies. So then the other thing that we do in government is often referred to the money, where the money come from and what are the expectations tied to the money. The federal budget in 2018 had actually increased investment in scientific research quite significantly, but did so with some strings attached. The government proposed to make significant new investment tied to clear objectives and conditions, so the next generation, including students, trainees, early career researchers, would be larger, more diverse, and better supported. So the granting councils were expected to achieve greater diversity among research funding recipients, including improving support for women, underrepresented groups, and early career researchers. And then there was a little extra money, $15 million for some pilot programs to improve equality and diversity in academia. I won't say much about those funding opportunities. They're both considered pilot programs. One of them is Dimensions. It really is aimed at institutions, universities, and colleges. And as well, actually, for institutions, there are capacity building grants, EDI capacity building grants, but that affects institutions more than it affects individuals. So I won't say much more about that. Before we actually got our tri-agency EDI action plan online, we put out this statement on EDI and see how really we place the notion of EDI in the context of research excellence. Achieving a more equitable, diverse, inclusive Canadian research enterprise is essential to creating the excellent, innovative, and impactful research that's necessary to advance knowledge and understanding and to respond to local, national, and global challenges. We have two broad objectives. The first one speaks of fair access to tri-agency research support. Four major elements to it. The data, and I'll say a lot more about that in a moment. We want to revise all of our policies, our plans, programs, processes, everything we do to make sure that there aren't those sort of unintended systemic barriers, and so that we can ensure that our support is equitable and inclusive. You may be hearing in some circles of a gender-based analysis plus. At CIHR, they refer to sex and gender-based analysis as GBA, and that is essentially taking a lens from a perspective of sex and gender or other diversity factors and really trying to see what is the impact of what we do, programs, policies, processes, et cetera, from the different perspectives of different individuals. Third element is really making sure that there's diversity in the decision-making, diverse people around the table in our governance committees, but also in our peer review evaluation committees. So more and more at NSERC, we are placing emphasis to try and have peer review committees that will be made up of 50% women and also 30% of other members of underrepresented groups. We've put that as a goal for us to attain in the next coming years. 2025 is when we hope to have those representation in all of our evaluation groups. And then the fourth element, I just will repeat myself by saying that we are building EDI very much into considerations that are integral to the criteria used to assess research excellence. The other overarching objective is to influence the ecosystem as a whole so that there is equitable participation. The initiatives I referred to, the pilot programs of Dimensions and EDI capacity building grants, are part of this objective. And ultimately what we want is for researchers, the research ecosystem, to be more representative of the Canadian population. And so we refer back to Census 2016 to look at the Canadian composition, demographic composition, and to look at our research communities in health sciences and natural sciences, engineering, social sciences, humanities, and see how we measure up to the Canadian population. So that brings me to the data that we've been collecting, self-identification data. First time we rolled out the questionnaire was in 2018. Most recently, we've revised it and added some answers to the questions and added a few questions. But basically, we're trying to ask people about their gender, man, women, other, gender fluid, non-binary, or two-spirit for Indigenous peoples. We do ask the question in terms of visible minority. One reason we do that is that it allows us to compare our information to what Stats Can collects, census included. And so in the 2018 version, we were simply asking a yes, no, and then to identify among certain groups. Now we added some options to this. Indigenous, again, asking if people are or not self-identifying as Indigenous, and which of the three groups, First Nation, Inuit, or Métis, or a person with a disability. And you notice that for each of these questions, we do let applicants, co-applicants choose not to answer. And what has been really comforting to us is to see that our community has been very responsive in self-identifying, and the percentage of folks who prefer not to answer a particular question is usually around only 5%. So that gives us a pretty good understanding of what is the makeup of our community. I hope you can see this well enough. I've drawn in red comparison between CIHR, because I think this may be most closely related to this group, but I've been paying mostly attention to the NSERC data. And at the top are our major research grant competition, but at the bottom of this table, you see the training. So let's just take a moment to look at this together. at the top, right, we have the 4 groups: women, Indigenous, people with disabilities, and visible minorities. So CIHR project grants, right, the mainstream funding opportunity at CIHR, about 35% of the application come in from women, and about 36% of recipients are women. So we see that there's good parity there. Just below, though, look at NSERC. Nowhere near the application pressure coming in from women in natural sciences engineering as there are in health sciences. So at about 22% of applicants, about 21% of the recipients who are women. Again, generally some reasonable parity. So it seems to indicate to us that there isn't necessarily some significant biases or unconscious biases. What we see, though, is that these numbers just don't come close to the Canadian population. Now, just below the red line, you see SSHRC, social sciences and humanities, draw 50% of women into their applications, into their funding opportunities. So you can just see there the difference between the differences between the communities. If we look over to Indigenous column, in the population, about 4.5% of Canadians self-identify as Indigenous. Less than 1% are part of the health sciences or natural sciences. 0.6% have applied for CIHR project grants. And the number of those who receive funding is so small that we have to actually suppress it. Same thing with natural sciences and engineering, just slightly better over in the social sciences and humanities. People with disabilities, according to the census, about 17% of Canadians identify as a person with a disability. Look at those numbers for our communities. 2% applying, 2.4% receiving awards at CIHR, 1.6, 1.5 at NSERC. So we're really troubled by those numbers. We do suspect that there's a bit less self-identification of people with disabilities, but we're still very preoccupied by this. And finally, the 4th column on visible minorities across the Canadian population, that number is about 22%. So it seems that fairly good representation of groups from different visible minorities and racialized groups, but it is far from uniform. So there are instances where some smaller groups are not anywhere near what their population numbers are at the Canadian level. Now, what's interesting when we go down to training is that the numbers are really looking better. We have hope in the next generation that these problems will kind of solve themselves. Fact is, the same trend has been persisting for a very long time. People will begin careers in health sciences, natural sciences, engineering, and then something dissuades them, something discourages them to continue on. So right now, if we look at CIHR, doctoral, about 62% are women, 53% though at the postdoc. So right there, that is a huge hurdle for women to continue from doctoral to postdoc in health sciences. For us in natural sciences engineering, 30%, slightly smaller drop to 35% at postdoc. But again, remember, we'd like to see that number closer to 50. And we could just do that exercise of looking across the different columns of Indigenous people with disabilities and visible minorities, and we generally see the same trend of drop-off. That has been referred to as the leaky pipeline. The little bit of anomaly there, far right, visible minorities in natural sciences postdoc, a higher rate of underrepresented or visible minority applicants than at the doctoral level. And I wish I had the clear explanation for that. So just now honing in a little bit on some NSERC data, the gray bar is the Canadian population in each of those 4 sets of columns. Very red, PhD, drop to PDF in yellow. The next yellow line is our Discovery Grants program. It is our basic applied research program. So first column, we see women at a certain rate, about 25%. But the white bar is our Alliance Research Partnership Program. And we see quite a difference there. Women less interested in partnerships than they are in doing discovery research. I'll skip the gender fluid non-binary two-spirit column, too small. Move to visible minorities column and look at the difference here. In terms of visible minorities, that yellow bar in the middle that represent discovery grants, less application pressure there, but greater application in alliance research partnerships. So we're still scratching our heads a little bit about that one. Proportion of women applicants. So the other interesting finding is that, of course, some disciplines are more attractive to certain types of people than others. Greater women represented through the life sciences that are funded by NSERC, so basic life sciences research. A bit of a drop off though for physical science, even more so engineering, computer science, mathematics, and statistics. And then again, we see a little bit of discrepancies between basic discovery grants and research partnerships through Alliance. And so we're really looking at the design of those programs to see why is it that some people are drawn to do basic research, seek the NSERC funding, but not seek funding from Alliance, not engage in those partnerships. So let me now come to my third section on how we are looking at evaluating research excellence in terms of the researcher, research teams, training, and the research process itself, and how we've been embedding EDI throughout all of this. To begin, though, I just want to say that, you know, for a long time, what we've recognized now is that there were some things that we really valued and measured, citation rates. But if we take an inclusive lens, a broader lens, then we'll want to look at researchers and what they do in terms of training, sponsorship, collaboration, engagement, mentoring, networking, communication, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is essentially how we're looking at a broader lens of evaluating research excellence. Again, placing EDI in research at the heart of what researcher excellence is all about: research process, HQP, training, et cetera, et cetera. The excellence of the researcher impact does not refer to quantitative indicators, but impact can be seen and not limited to advancing knowledge, developing technology, addressing socioeconomic and environmental needs, or contributing to increased diversity and gender equity in research. So we hope that more and more those senior PIs, heads of labs, are paying attention to how things are conducted around them and how they can support greater equity, diversity, inclusion. In training, we really want the whole process to be considered. How are, when there are opportunities, how are they promoted? What type of outreach? According to a closed circle, or expanding the circle of potential candidates to be brought into a pool? How to recruit? What is the process? Who is involved? What diversity is there around the panel of reviewers for job applications? More about the hiring. How are those negotiations? What type of training environment is provided? What type of mentorship is provided? More and more, when we're evaluating the research training environment, and NSERC places a lot of emphasis on research training, we want to see that applicants will have considered training throughout that whole spectrum of activities. In teams, looking at diverse groups of co-applicants and making sure that EDI are considerations that are reflected in the team composition and roles within a team. So yes, we had women and we had men. They were the boss, they were the secretaries. Looks like an old picture, but in fact, you can see that sometimes underrepresented groups have lesser roles to play in teams, and those from majority groups have greater roles to play in teams. And that's something that we're trying to bring balance to. Inviting applicants to describe how they have implemented policies, practices that support EDI in their teams. And then borrowing very much, or building on what CIHR had been doing for nearly a decade now, expecting in the context of health research, there be direct consideration as to the sex and or gender consideration, sex in the biological term and gender in the context of societally how people present. We've taken a similar approach now in natural sciences engineering. Of course, does not apply to everything, maybe not in astrophysics, but certainly in context of engineering and other applied research and technology that we fund, considerations of who will be ultimately the users, and whether the consideration of sex, gender, and other diversity factors are really brought to the front in the context of the whole research process, in terms of the research questions that are asked, the design, the methodologies of data collection and data analysis, interpretation, and even the dissemination of results. So this is how we're now embedding EDI in the research process, similarly to what CIHR had done with sex gender-based analysis. NCEs had been paying attention to EDI as well. I just wanted to pull up this paragraph of what is expected of NCEs, and equity diversity is included there in terms of their governance and not just. And there's a nice sort of checklist when considering EDI in NCE. So I hope that BioCanRx has been revisiting that, that set of expectations. And I also wanted to really remind this audience that CIHR has a lot of resources on an EDI web page. And so I invite you to familiarize yourself with information that is presented there. So that is what I wanted to cover today. I hope there are questions, or we can just talk. And I think perhaps now that I've got my screen open, I can also look at chat questions in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for the talk, Karine, before we get into some questions. I know on a personal note, my role at BioCanRx is the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Specialist. So this is a topic very close to my heart that I'm passionate about. And I just wanted to note to our audience of trainees that earlier this year, BioCanRx officially launched our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Action Plan. And that covers a lot of things from trainings to sponsorships and other studentship opportunities. And so I do invite anyone who's interested to check that out on our website, and you can always email me feedback on it. I think that's an important point in EDI and doing these action plans and doing this work, is to always be open to feedback, especially from our community, because this is who it should be representing. But yeah, that's just a quick note on that. But thank you so much for the talk.